Hello and welcome to Attacking Third, a CBS Sports Soccer podcast. I'm Sandra Herrera, lead NWSL writer for CBS Sports, joined today as always by my colleague and co-host Lisa Roman, NWSL analyst and broadcaster. On today's episode, we have a breaking news update segment for everyone. The investigation on former Chicago Red Stars head coach Rory Dames has come to light with additional allegations regarding the youth club system. And there is an update on Washington Spirit ownership. There is a lot to get through during these segments. But first, a quick reminder to follow us on Twitter for all breaking news at Attacking Third. And if you're listening to this as a podcast, please go ahead and give us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Lisa, how are you doing? It almost sort of seems like we wouldn't see this type of day come for either. Maybe just for we're breaking this down into two parts. We're going to do Chicago and then the Spirit. But I mean that more on the Spirit side of things, in which we've been watching this ongoing saga of
Mhm.
back and forth ownership, and then additional reporting coming out with coaching in the youth system and the problems that are there at that level as well. It's not going to be an easy episode to get through by any means, but I'm glad to be here with you to
Yeah,
chat about it all.
yeah, I'm thankful I have you, right? I can bounce my thoughts and feelings off of it with you. We've had to do this a lot
Yeah.
in the last few months, and I don't want to say I'm getting used to it because I'm not, and I never will. But in terms of Washington Spirit and their ownership conversation, we'll get to that, but it's about time. And then in terms of the new allegations and the new reports against former Chicago Red Stars head coach Rory Dames, shedding light on what is a very toxic youth system in America. And really that's what I want to talk about because there's a niche group of players that have played at the professional level, right? There's even a bigger group, but still a small group of athletes that have competed collegiately. But players that play at the youth level, especially soccer, it's such a youth-driven sport. There's almost everyone you speak with says, "Oh yeah, I kicked a soccer ball as a little kid. That was my first team. I was 5. I was green." So it's much more common to have players at the youth level, and to see that it's common that there could be abuse at the youth level is difficult to hear, difficult to talk about, but something that needs to be brought into the light and hopefully corrected sooner rather than later.
Yeah, this additional reporting, right, coming out of the Washington Post. I guess we can start for people who are new to this, perhaps who are just jumping into this sequence of events, to catch them up and bring them up to speed. Perhaps former Chicago Red Stars head coach Rory Dames did resign from his almost decade-long position with the club after a NWSL championship loss to the Washington Spirit in the 2021 final. Just to refresh folks' memories, the resignation was issued in the middle of the night, just maybe around 36 hours or so after the championship. And then additional reporting released from the Washington Post that discussed and highlighted various misconduct. Various types of abuse, whether it was verbal, emotional, verging on all kinds of inappropriate behaviors in terms of relationships between player and coach. It was not an easy read for that type of reporting, which stemmed from a very specific timeline, kind of around the 2016 and 2018 reports that were brought forth to US soccer specifically. And that ultimately those reports fell on what was deaf ears in terms of players trying to bring these types of allegations forward, and then having that just sort of be accepted, quite frankly,
Mhm.
as part of the unfortunate status quo. So we're talking about reports as recent as 2018 from a former player, a Red Stars player, and Kristen Press directly to U.S. Soccer, saying, "I think that Rory emotionally abuses players. He doesn't have safe distance between himself and his player. He uses his power and status as the coach to manipulate players to get close to them." So a number of former Red Stars players and numbers of players in general sort of coming forth and putting themselves as on record sources in initial reporting from the Post, amongst a ton of other anonymous sources highlighting the professional level, right? But this additional reporting that came alongside or just after that is really highlighting um, ongoing systematic issues within the youth level. And that is, I think, what's probably the most disturbing angle, right, about this additional reporting is that we're continuing to hear a specific line of behavior that went on for a very, very long time. And with this most recent reporting, it's highlighting things going as far back into the 90s. So it was a very, very difficult read, but it's very recent because as of our recording of this, it was published just today on February the 8th.
Yes, it's very important to kind of look back at the history of this and the context of it, because he resigned in the middle of the night. The allegations and reports from 2014 and 2018 were released, and since late November we haven't heard anything about the investigation of Rory Dames and what he's done. And he has such an empire, or had such an empire in the youth system with Eclipse Soccer, really controlling the Chicago suburbs of soccer players, specifically young female players. But just his control over the youth system dates back to 1996 when he started Eclipse and he started running this. And the fact that in the Washington Post investigative article that did come out today on Tuesday, February 8th, is that there are reports from decades ago. 1998 is the very first report of any misconduct by Rory Dames. I think that it's also kind of important to touch on as we go through these details that there are a lot of women that came forward and put their name on this and came out as sources to say, this happened to me, and giving specific accounts and specific details of what happened. Because as the reports happened in 1998, nothing came of it. He continued to grow as this soccer god, in a sense, of especially the youth system. If you grew up in Chicago and you had any desire of playing soccer past the high school level, you needed to play for Rory Dames. You needed to play in Eclipse. Across the world, you needed to play in leagues like ECNL, which is a league that he started and he was a founding member of, and he sat on the board of. So he had his hand in every single pot of the soccer world, from youth levels all the way up to the collegiate levels. He could get players scholarships. He could get them Division 1 programs. He could help them with signing professional contracts. He could help them get onto the US national team at every different level, from the youth teams to the senior teams. He had a say and he had influence in your soccer career if you played in Chicago. And I think that's really like the terrifying
Yeah.
thing of this, is that he had so much power. And despite former players bringing that to the attention of local law enforcement in 1998, they did an investigation and they talked with over 150 of his current players. And ultimately, they deemed that he was okay to continue coaching and to continue to gain power and continue to grow as a very powerful soccer person in and around Chicago, continuing to coach at Eclipse and continuing to coach young women, and then moving up into NWSL. And after 1998, it wasn't really brought to the attention of public authority or law enforcement again until Kristen Press did that in 2014, and then again in 2018, and now in ultimately at the end of 2021 and in 2022. So the gapping is devastating, because this was happening, that he never stopped. There was never a slowdown of his abuse and his misconduct.
I think that's part of what's so jarring, right? When you read these reports and when you sort of start looking at all of the correlation between um, the power dynamic that gets put in place, you just sort of witness time after time as years went on, just the power infrastructure that ended up continuing to be built up around and centered around this specific person to continue to be able to sort of have this sort of ability to just freely come and go and perpetuate these types of behaviors in the open practically. I mean, there's a parent on record in this reporting, and that is part of what's so devastating in reading about this, is that when you read throughout all of these different reportings, whether it's people who are going on record or not, you can see and point out and look at all the different areas in which a lot of these children, because I think people are forgetting that they're children, were failed. And it starts in every area, whether it's within the youth club system, the coaches within that who continue to enable it, and the fact that there are parents who are at these games and are bearing witness to certain behaviors that are maybe unsettling to them, but still participating in this sort of kind of gross cash cow that's like in place when it comes
Mhm.
to youth club culture. I think it was important to know within this reporting, drawing those direct lines between them, how there are other NWSL coaches who have been publicly accused of abusive behaviors just last year, whether it was former head coach of the North Carolina Courage and Paul Riley, or the former head coach of Washington Spirit in Richie Berg. You're talking about other coaches who had prominent places in youth club cultures, and then alongside with somebody who, in Rory Dames, was head of Eclipse. So reading all this, it's devastating in a multitude of ways, but I think it's particularly painful to know that children, young
Mhm.
teenagers, were put through this. To sort of read that a grown adult man in his brain somehow found it acceptable to fat shame 10-year-olds is
Mhm.
appalling, quite frankly. No one should do that to anybody. Or say abusive things to anyone of any age. But the fact that somebody created an environment in which that was accepted is absolutely devastating.
It really is, and it starts as fat shaming, right? And knowing that as a player, when you go to practice, if you um, don't play at your top level, if you were at Rory Dames practice and you didn't play at your top level, you were going to run. You were going to be screamed at. You were probably not going to play that weekend. There was a lot of terrifying um, reactions that would come if you didn't perform as he was expecting. And so it starts with yelling, and it starts with that verbal abuse in fat shaming 10-year-olds, and ultimately it escalates and it grows, and that's where these stories really that's what they told us, and that's what these women talked about in this article and in this investigation. That one woman saying that he had an inappropriate relationship with her from age 14 until well into her college career. She actually called it grooming, in a sense of manipulating her and convincing her that without him, she would be nowhere in her soccer career. Then, when she turned 18, he used his power over her soccer career and his control over her to actually have sex with her. As a former player, this is in the early 2000s, so this was happening for years and years and years. The fat shaming, the actual abuse that came with the emotional abuse and the verbal abuse that happened. He would often make sexual jokes and comments about these young women that he was coaching, these children, right? I mean, 14 years old, talking about their personal lives, asking about their boyfriends, bringing up the players' sex lives. One player goes on record, former player, saying that at practice they were about to do a sprinting drill, a fitness drill, and he had all the players get on their knees, and he made a snide comment at her saying, "Hey, I bet you know this position well." Just uncomfortable situations. And she said, "What do you do if I said anything about it? I wasn't going to play that weekend, and I was trying to play in college. I was looking to continue my soccer career. I couldn't say anything." And as a young female at 14, to have your coach saying that to you, it's embarrassing and it's uncomfortable. You don't want to tell your parents that. That's uncomfortable. And he knew the power that he had over these young women and these young girls to be able to control them in every aspect of their lives, sending them text messages late at night and instant messages at all hours of the day, telling them to come over, telling them to come to his apartment and join him. Just completely inappropriate on every level that he coached.
And it's jarring to sort of see that connection to the time that's passed, right? With some
Mhm.
of these sources putting their names to it, saying that they're almost 40 now, or someone who's almost 30 now, and et cetera, et cetera. And it goes on. I think someone was I think as young as 21 or 22. It was something that was uh, ongoing, and just sort of the fact that there were areas of this that uh, kind of happened out in the open, right? That there was an attempt at one point as early as the 90s to try to, where some of these players tried to almost protect each other and try to have an investigation, go forth. Even then, it just paints a very stark and poor and sad and heartbreaking picture of the youth system in this country, quite frankly. And just sort of knowing that there were additional coaches at one point in a league like NWSL who had these strong footholds in youth club soccer systems to be able to, reach these types of levels. It's just reading all through this almost sort of makes you feel like you're on a constant merry-go-round, and you're wondering where you're going to when you're going to get off or anytime. So it's just like it's just ongoing. And I think within this reporting, I think it's also very important to see the growth and the strength of these sources, right?
Mhm.
Of these victims who are coming forth to put their stories on record. I mean, at one point, you know, referring to how these victims have the verbiage and they have the right words to be able to express, and detail the abuses that they endured back then. At one point saying like, I didn't, these sources are saying I didn't have the appropriate words, but now I understand what was happening. It was
Yeah.
grooming. Like part of them being able to come forth now is because of a lot of the societal efforts that are trying to be made, whether it's through investigative reporting like this or otherwise, to highlight these very problematic systematic institutions. So just knowing that we're coming off of a season, a year where you can literally name off and count out former coaches that have ties to youth club systems. It's I think it's a level of reckoning that has almost long been coming, and just to sort of see it kind of come out. It's painful every time you're reading it, you're seeing it. But it's something that is unfortunately going to be a painful part of the process if those in the soccer space want this sport to continue to succeed in this country. And the fact that there's former players and victims who are willing to now in their adulthood be
Mhm.
able to talk about these things are such an essential part of that process.
You mentioned one of a mother, a parent of a player actually went on as a source in this article to talk about this. And I think that's really important to kind of uh, touch on because as a young player, it's hard to recognize when things maybe aren't correct. And these sources say that. They say that they didn't know that it was that wrong. They just knew that they didn't like it, but no one else was saying anything. No one else was complaining. Their parents were at practice, their parents were at games watching them, seeing this and not saying anything themselves. So as a young person, you don't always know that it's wrong. And so now to have these sources coming out in this investigation and sharing their horrible experiences that they were faced with, even though they are 40 now, they're 30, they're looking back on their lives. I know one of the sources says that she has a daughter now and she can't imagine letting her daughter go through with that, being a witness to that and seeing that. Because if you know that your kid isn't playing on a weekend and you ask your kid what happened and they say, I don't know, I passed the ball wrong in practice, it's interesting. And there's different levels that need to be looked into at that. And now that these former players have the strength and the words to come forward and to put phrasing on what they experienced and give verbiage to the emotions, the shame, the uncomfortability that they felt as young players is very important, because not a lot of people at age 14 know what grooming is, know that they can recognize it when they're in the middle of it, know that they can recognize verbal abuse, emotional abuse, manipulation, because they haven't experienced enough of life. And that's what he did. He started coercing these players when they were young enough so that by the time they were 18 and 20 and playing at the collegiate level, he still had a control over them. So these players coming back and being sources, even a former player's mom being a source in this, is bringing a lot of light to the situation and hopefully giving current parents of youth players the verbiage to speak with their own children about their own experiences, because I think that's something that needs to happen. As horrible as it is to talk about all of this, to have the verbiage to understand this situation is important.
Yeah. Also, within this reporting, I think it's important to note that U.S. Soccer, it was reported within this same additional reporting about abuse within the youth club level, that U.S. Soccer did suspend Dames's licenses. I believe it was during the fall of 2021. Also of equal importance, I think, to highlight the fact that since the very curious resignation in the middle of the night, there has not been any public facing media availability from Chicago Red Stars. And I think a lot of people maybe learned about the fact that James's license were suspended initially, to begin with, from U.S. Soccer. So there just hasn't been a lot of uh, any type of public facing anything regarding this, when you're thinking about the areas in which, you know, James obtained his licensing, or areas in which, organizations in which he coached for a long time. And I'm sure that that's something that is perturbing, I think, in terms of public who find themselves as even just a casualist, most casual a fan of this league and this sport. So it's you just have to imagine that even with this type of additional reporting to any prior reporting, it almost still just sort of feels like, as if this is just the beginning. you know this is absolutely just one area of youth club soccer in this country, of which there are many throughout the United States. So if it's happening in the Midwest, if we knew that, based on um, former head coaches like Paul Riley or Richie Burke, that's happening on the East Coast. I'm sure there's players with stories on the West Coast and other parts of this country. And it is just absolutely heartbreaking again that this is just something that young children go through when they're just simply trying to play a sport that they love.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot more to get through, and if for whatever reason, if there is additional reporting on this particular story or any other stories, we will do our best to keep our listeners updated. But in the meantime, we have to transition into some other very important news affecting the NWSL, and we'll get into that right after a quick break. Other news that came way on February 8th is a bit of an ownership update for Washington Spirit. We've been talking about the news that we're discussing on this episode, Lisa, and we're framing it in ways which it just sort of feels like we got to go back and do like a timeline or like a quick catch up of like what's happening. And when we were thinking about this sort of conclusion, right, to this to this ongoing reporting, and that why Michele Kang will in fact become the new owner of the Washington Spirit, we still have to go back a little bit, even with this one, because this is not something that came easily, right? By any means.
No, this was a very long process with the Washington Spirit, the ownership saga, as we've been referring to it here at Attacking Third. I mean, months of infighting and power struggle between Washington Spirit, then majority owner Steve Baldwin, and founding owner Bill Lynch, with minority owner Michele Kang. There's finally a resolution, but a little bit of background on this is the players were in support of Michele Kang gaining ownership, my majority ownership. If you're an owner of a club and you have majority ownership, you then sit on a board of the NWSL and you have voting power within the league and within your club, something that Washington Spirit was stripped of towards the end of the 2021 season because of this fighting and because of a lot of the miscommunication and things that were happening in the front offices at Washington Spirit. So Michele Kang was working to gain majority ownership from Steve Baldwin and Bill Lynch. She put in an offer for $35 million, which is a very high offer for an NWSL club, the highest by almost $30 million for a club that ultimately they turned down. They were looking at different owners, and that was a little peculiar. Why would you turn down such a high offer for someone that has good intentions to own this club and to do good things with it? But it is official out as of Tuesday, February 8th. Washington Spirit ownership have come to an agreement. A statement from the Washington Spirit says the owners of the Washington Spirit have agreed on a new ownership structure. Local business leader Michele Kang will acquire the interests of other team owners Bill Lynch and Steve Baldwin. Kang will be the controlling owner, working with other investors in new ownership groups. So Kang has voting power. She has a say in the league, something that has been really happening for months and months and months. There is finally a resolution on the ownership of Washington Spirit.
It's probably over the course of the last 4 to 5 months, right?
Yeah.
That there's sort of been this like real specific interfighting between ownerships, different ownership investors specifically, alongside of just all of the other things that this club was having to go through. At one point, we started to maybe sort of see the cracks, right, within things very, very early into maybe mid-season, with disagreements around the head coaching, and how an investigation was taking place around former head coach Richie Burke, and sort of the handling of that there was intention to still retain this former head coach in some type of front office capacity. And then as more information started to surface around Burke and his own abusive behaviors, and creating a toxic environment in the trainings with the Spirit, started to come into light, started to obviously bring into question the leadership of the majority owners in place, with Bill Lynch and Steve Baldwin, as the connection was made that Burke arrived to the Spirit due to personal relationships that he had with these now former owners. So we started to sort of maybe see the cracks, right, of some conflicting viewpoints, right, in terms of how the club should be ran. And this was all in a year in which a lot of different smaller minority investors became a part of the Washington Spirit ahead of that 2021 season. And then you add in the mix of obviously all the complications that came into play with that they had to deal with, like with COVID, and having been issued forfeitures. And then behind the scenes of all that was still a lot of inner fighting that ended up growing and growing and growing over time, as you started to see the departures of other women who were in different administrative positions with this club kind of make their exit as well. So it raised a lot of red flags, right? And then all of a sudden, everything just started to get very, very, very open in public in terms of that interfighting. A lot of oftentimes we saw different reports about emails being leaked and things like that. And then finally, I think it came the biggest pause I think came was that the players had a say on
Yeah.
this at one point in the middle of their season, in the middle of a playoff push, I should say, because it was really at the latter end of the season. But the players coming together and putting together a statement of their own, in which they referenced why Michele Kang specifically as someone who they had trust in to go ahead and lead the Washington Spirit into a new era, and calling for Steve Baldwin to eventually sell those shares. But the interfighting continued. There was an attempt to try to bring in another investor group to sell to, undercutting why Michele Kang's previous offer of 35 million. There was a lot of back and forth as those two specifically kind of went back and forth for control. But it started to really take a turn, Lisa, right? As we kept coming on these episodes to try to fill in everyone as best as we could. It seemed like it was changing every week almost. But Kang ultimately started working alongside the other minority investors, all of these other smaller co-owners, to essentially align themselves with King, and she was able to ultimately obtain voting control within the club. And that was maybe a bit of the final chess move, right? Maybe that sort of set into motion this absolute final phase of becoming the new owner of Washington Spirit, because even though she was working with the smaller co-investors at the time, there still had to be a meeting that was held with the NWSL Board of Governance. There was a Baldwin who was calling into question the validity of why Michele Kang trying to work alongside minority investors, to try to obtain control of the club, excuse me. But ultimately, the NWSL Board of Governors said, hey, you know what? This was a legal process. She has obtained the appropriate alignment with those minority investors, and it's actually in the hands of your own LLC at this point.
Mhm.
And whatever comes to fruition, we will acknowledge that to be true. And so ultimately, everything came to a head, and it was a little, we were a little nervous still, even till this final moment, because we saw the release. We were like, okay, so she's acquired control. And then it isn't until later into the release where you see, in fact, Steve Baldwin quoted within this release saying, I spoke with Michele this morning and I told her that Bill and I decided to sell her the team. So that process is now coming to an end, and why Michele Kang is going to be the official owner of the Washington Spirit moving forward.
The back and forth was so much behind closed doors, and maybe unofficially, I'm going to say, just because it wasn't as legally as it could have been right from the very beginning. It is tried to be conversations of, listen, I have really good interests for this team, and the supporters group saying sell the team, Steve, and really almost why Michele Kang and Steve Baldwin trying to work it out amongst themselves at first, which did not work at all. Ultimately, why Michele Kang having to go to these other investors and say, listen, if you give me voting power and voting control, I will make these decisions for this team, and you can still be partial owners. But in order for her to get voting power, she needed to kind of gain the trust of other investors. And that's what she did, which, as you said, then it became like a legal thing on paper. And at that point,
Yeah.
Steve Baldwin realized he didn't have any power anymore, because legally she had done what she needed to do. Instead of buying it from him, she had found power through the other investors and was able to gain their trust, and saying that their interests aligned with not only each other but also with the club and the players and then the supporters group and everyone of interest in the Washington Spirit. And ultimately, Steve Baldwin kind of had to accept his fate and say, okay, we will sell to you, because he didn't want to sell to her. That's what's so fascinating about all of this, that in the end he still has to sell to her and give her power, when, I mean, like, looking at this as big picture, this could have happened months ago. But
Yeah.
It didn't. There's a lot of back and forth, a power struggle of who has more power, who has more money. It was a lot going back and forth. And I mean, hello, fans of the NWSL, please remember that throughout all of this infighting with the owners and the front office drama that was happening, the team on the field still went
Oh my
on to
God.
dominate the second half of the season, to rip through the playoffs and win an NWSL championship at the end of all of this, which
Yeah.
on paper, maybe it makes the team worth more, but no, the players were completely separate from the ownership throughout this year, and they did what they needed to do, crossing the white line, stepping onto the field. And every time we talked to the players about the 2021 season, they said that they needed to lean on each other
Yeah.
while still having Tori Huster, midfielder for the Spirit and defender for the Spirit, who is head of the Players Association, also fighting for a CBA that the league ultimately ratified right before the preseason. There's just so many different factors heading into this. The last thing they needed was their owners fighting over power. But in the end, the 2022 season is here. Why Michele Kang has voting control and full majority ownership of the Washington Spirit, which is something that the players wanted, and we are here.
Yeah, it's so wild just sort of even like hear you like reflect back on that. It's just like somebody someday is gonna do it. I'm absolutely gonna be sitting down with a bowl of popcorn when the Washington Spirit saga comes to 30 for 30 or whoever, right? Like I will absolutely like sit down and watch it. I think another point of interest, in this announcement that this is officially happening, that this is officially in motion and going through for new ownership for the Spirit, is that there's already King is already implementing her vision for the future
Yeah.
of this franchise, and saying that they're looking forward to an exciting new chapter. That there's already a vision in place, and that they're giving it a slogan, calling it "Premier, Professional, and Proudly DC," with a locally based female-led ownership group that is committed to substantial new investments into the team's staff, operations, and infrastructure. So it's going to be, I think, something that we still keep an eye on, because this is a little bit historic, right? This is a little bit groundbreaking in that a non-white woman is coming into uh predominant majority ownership of an NWSL club, and is in doing so is absolutely reshaping the landscape of
Mhm.
what it means and what it looks like, and how ownership is defined and like in looks moving forward. So I think that's something big that we're gonna have to keep an eye on, and sort of seeing how the Spirit continue to navigate this space in NWSL moving forward.
I think that's exactly right. We will have to look at that and kind of see what adjustments happen. But I mean, so much news happening today on this February 8th, and we're in the start of the 2022 preseason.
Preseason.
A lot of different changes, but we're going to power through, right? We have a season ahead of us. We have a lot of players to watch and to cheer for throughout this year. Let's hope that all this drama is in the past.
We'll see. We'll see what's going on. I mean, we absolutely have been trying our best to keep up to date with it, right? Keep our listeners up to date with it as best we can, because again, it almost feels like there was something continuously ongoing with this story throughout 2021 and now even into 2022. But like you said, it is officially preseason, and that is the mode that we are also on at Attacking Third. So we want to thank everybody for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at Attacking Third for more news. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and anywhere listening to your podcast shows. You can leave us a 5-star review on Spotify now. And if you have any questions for us, you can leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts with your question, and Lisa and I will answer it during our mailbag segment. We're also available as videos. You can subscribe to us on YouTube. Visit youtube.com/Attacking Third. And we'll be back on tomorrow with more team by team previews across NWSL. For Sandra Herrera and Lisa Roman, this was Attacking Third.